Welcome to the Stressless Eating Podcast, where we help diet-obsessed and food-crazed women break themselves out of the food and body prison, end the dieting madness, and take control of their health for good. I'm your host, Leanne Ellington, and this podcast is about answering one question. How can you heal your relationship with food and your body and take a practical approach to this whole self-love journey, but without all that restriction, obsession, and shame, and without needing years of therapy to do so? If you want to know the answer, you're in the right place. All this information is 100% free, so please subscribe to and review our podcast. In last week's episode of the podcast, I told you all about the 5 ingredients that I wholeheartedly believe comprise your self-image. Now, I definitely invite all women to go define these ingredients for themselves because we all have our own unique recipe. My recipe won't work for you and yours won't work for me. We all need our own. But before I get into the ins and outs of that with my clients, I believe it's really important that they understand what's standing in their way from having a powerful and loving and confident self-image. And that's what this episode is dedicated to helping you discover. I want you to understand what's standing in your way so that you have those awarenesses ingrained in your mind and you can see it all as it shows up. But the truth is, I also want you to start having more compassion for yourself. And it's really, really hard to have compassion for that which we don't fully understand. So I've found that once again, when women understand why they do what they do, then they can practice compassion towards themselves. So are you ready for, less judgment and more love, and not this fluffy, frilly kind of love, like a practical understanding of it, like really understanding yourself so that you can have more compassion? So let's get clear on what's standing in your way. Let's be honest. Your inner critic, she can be pretty brutal. And after a while, it can wear you down. Like, we all have that version of ourselves that we wish would go away. Like that version of ourselves that preys on our insecurities. She takes us away from our goals and generally just makes us feel not so good. So I call that your inner bitch. And we've talked a lot about what I call the weight of the weight here on the podcast. And there's 4 of them in total. And we briefly touched on number 2 in another episode, the weight of walking around with your inner bitch running the show. So specifically, it's the weight of harsh judgments, self-criticism, guilt, shame, blame, comparisonitis, and perfectionism that lives in our self-image and our self-talk. And it's the emotion that typically comes alongside food and your body and all that health stuff. And again, I'll remind you, it doesn't have to be there. So if you have a voice in your head, really like that voice that is judging you based on what or how much you do or you don't eat, or that voice that's telling you like, this is just who you are, or this is how you are, or it's how you'll always be. If you have that inner critic whispering in your ear all the things that you're not doing, reminding you of what you don't like about yourself, or all the ways that you think you're failing, or that voice telling you you're not enough, like that you'll never be skinny enough, successful enough, pretty enough, good enough, period. I call that your inner bitch. And that is the real weight that needs to be ditched. Like, you've got to stop feeding her. And in that episode, I shared that one parable about the 2 wolves. It goes like this. So one evening, an old Cherokee Indian told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, "My son, the battle is between 2 wolves inside all of us. One is evil. It is anger, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf wins? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one that you feed. So yes, judgment, guilt, shame, blame, and comparison can be used as powerful tools when used strategically, but for most women, they've become a massive weapon of internal resistance and judgment. And that's because feeling guilty about what you did or didn't do, or, feeling ashamed of your habits or your behaviors or who you're showing up as, or continually blaming yourself, like blaming others or blaming those darn irresistible cookies for being so good, or comparing yourself to where you think you should be or what you should be doing, or comparing your worst to someone else's best, or letting your inner perfectionist run the show. And with her, it's never enough. Like you'll never be enough or doing enough or good enough or smart enough, skinny enough, just enough, period. That is the part that's not working. And this is what's causing you so much unhappiness. So again, what are you feeding? Because I promise you, you are getting fed either way. It's just a matter of if you let your default take over or if you consciously feed it. And just like we talked about back in the Tale of Two Cookies back in episode 1, it's not benign. In fact, it's the part that's fattening. So what if you ditched that weight? The weight of harsh judgments, self-criticism, guilt, shame, blame, comparisonitis, and emotion that typically comes alongside food and your body and all that other stuff, and it does not have to. It's easy to notice when you're receiving this kind of treatment from somebody else. But what do you do when you realize you've entered into a self-critical or downright abusive relationship with yourself? So whether it's your relationship with your body, your relationship with food, your relationship with how you're feeling, what you're doing, who you're being on a day-to-day basis, it can all be put into that category of your relationship with you. So if you're currently talking to yourself a certain way or regarding yourself a certain way or looking at yourself a certain way and just generally treating yourself a certain way and it is not serving you and your life, it's time for something better, sister. It's time for a new way of seeing things, a new way of doing things. Because you see, I really don't believe that any woman has a time problem or a confidence problem or a weight problem. And I don't think that any woman really lacks motivation or willpower or purposely self-sabotages her journey, especially for the stuff that you really do want. And so all of those things are simply symptoms that you've been practicing a relationship with yourself that does not serve you, and it isn't keeping you truly happy or fulfilled. And again, it's a very heavy and weighted relationship, like walking around every single day with the weight of the weight, both physically and metaphorically, or walking around every single day with the weight of goals or game plans or programs that outright suck or that you just can't possibly stick with long term. Or really just walking around every day with the weight of how you're feeling, like what you're thinking, what you're doing, and who you're being every single day. And again, it is all dead weight. Like it does not have to be there, and you don't have to keep practicing it. And you don't have to have this relationship with yourself any longer. Like, you know you want more and you need more. And truth is, you deserve more. And I think you should go get it. So if you feel like you are in a relationship with your own biggest bitch rather than your own BFF or sister, it is time for you to ditch her. Like, ditch the bitch. It's time to break up with your old self, your old way of thinking regarding yourself and treating yourself, and just go meet yourself again. Like, start over with her. So again, it's all about awareness. And whenever I talk to a woman, pretty much every woman that I know, she's pretty clear that she has her own inner bitch in general. Like, we all have one, right? But again, the more aware we are of what's actually causing it, the more power we have to go shift it. And in this episode, I'm going to cover the 5 most common causes of your inner bitchery and how to ditch it. So without further ado, let's talk about how to ditch the bitch in 5 easy steps. So step number 1 is ditch the guilt. Okay, so we're going to talk about both guilt and shame. And spoiler alert, shame is actually step number 2. But first, I'm going to talk about the distinction between the two because a lot of people confuse guilt and shame. So in ways, guilt and shame are 2 different states or feelings on the same continuum. So guilt is feeling bad about something that you did, and shame is feeling bad about who you are. So for example, guilt would say, hey, I ate a cookie. That act or sin was bad or wrong or unhealthy. And the origin of the word guilt literally means a sin or a crime, okay? On the other hand, shame says, I ate that cookie, therefore I am bad, or I have no willpower, or I'm weak-willed. Like there's something wrong with me. Shame is feeling bad about who you are. So shame is more personal. Like it's no longer about the cookie or about what you did. It's about the person. And the word shame, like the etymology of it, it literally means loss of reputation. And so a little side note, as you can tell, I'm kind of mildly obsessed with language and word origins, or etymology as it's called. So you'll hear me reference word origins a lot. Because, what we say and what we mean, sometimes it doesn't align. And I just started realizing that quite a few years ago, and I just started looking up. I'm like, what does that actually mean? Am I saying what I mean and meaning what I say? And so anyway, so back to guilt and shame. So guilt and shame are reactions on the same continuum. They share the same data, or like the account of what actually happened. So in this case, like I ate the cookie in this example. They just simply entail different summaries or meanings or translations of that event. So first, let's talk about guilt. Guilt zaps the fun out of the here and now, of the right now. Like if your inner rule enforcer or your inner food police or whatever she is, if she's always chiming in about the right or wrong way to do something, or what's good or bad, or what you should, would, or could be doing, like, and again, this is all in comparison to the status quo or your idea of perfection, of course, you're never gonna get to actually enjoy the experience of your life. Or if generally you're living in the framework of good, bad, right, wrong, should, shouldn't, have tos, need tos, supposed tos, you're setting yourself up to always feel guilt. It's a rules-based mentality, and that always means that judgment comes alongside it, especially if you're talking about food, but it's really for all areas of your life, right? So if you want to start looking to see where the rules and the frameworks and the language that you're using are causing you to put the guilt in guilty pleasure, right? So are you calling food or fat or calories or carbs or anything like that good or bad? Are you using words like healthy or unhealthy, or should or shouldn't? And again, these are words that have language and meanings and associations that you probably never created. Like we can and will do an entire episode about like the definitions of healthy and unhealthy, because as you've learned before, my old definition of healthy was like eat less, move more, and count and track and weigh and measure. And I think a lot of women have that association with the word health, even though it's not a definition that serves us. So that's one example of why it's so important to like really pay attention to the meanings of words. But anyways, back to what I was saying, these hard and fast rules about food and like the diet mentality are almost always going to cause guilt as a byproduct. So be super mindful of your language and where guilt is becoming a weapon against yourself. And this is just another example where it's not the food that's the problem. It's who you're being while you're eating it, and like the thinking and the framework and the diet mentality that's causing it. And of course, again, I'm talking about food, but it's true with anything. So what's the solution? Well, I'll be the first to say it's beyond the scope of this conversation, as this is the kind of thing I work on with my clients for 12 weeks to conquer. But part of it is simply knowing that if something is going to cause you guilt, Like first, be aware of it. Like you've been down this road before. You know that something's going to cause you guilt. We just have to bring the awareness to it. And then I teach my clients this process of how to, what I call reverse engineer how they want to feel. Like, and then they make the decision that would enable them to enjoy their experience guilt-free. So whether that's kale salad or whether it's a cookie or a cheeseburger, like regardless, if you're going to do it, find a way to let yourself enjoy it, right? And so that is the key, like giving yourself permission, but obviously not too much permission, right? But again, like what we're talking about today is really just the first step. Like you've got to become aware of what's causing the guilt in order to figure out what your solution would or might be. So now back to the shame conversation. And that's exactly what step number 2 is. It's ditch the shame. So again, shame is feeling bad about who you are based on what you did. Like calling yourself names, living in an emotional home where you're ashamed of who you're being because of something that you did. So like eating that cupcake does not mean that you're weak-willed or a self-sabotager, but of course we're calling ourselves things like that, right? In fact, nothing about what you do or don't do has to mean anything about who you are as a person. But that's the part that we're walking around not even realizing, right? And that's why I'm just trying to bring this to your attention. And so here's the reality. I'm not telling you that you need to love or be proud of all of your decisions or actions, right? We're human. But you don't need to confuse your actions with who you are either. One of my favorite quotes is that what you did is not who you are, right? And so you also, on top of this, like you don't need to apologize for how you feel. And you certainly don't need to apologize for your past or hide yourself or disgrace yourself or shame yourself for what you did or didn't do. And so for me, I've done a lot of work on my own shame. And there's a lot of things that I've done that I'm not proud of. And I used to live in shame as my emotional home. But a big part of healing it for me was really shifting my beliefs about it. So for example, for some like big stuff, right? Some of the stuff that I just mentioned, I'm like, I'm not proud of it. I would never, ever, 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 ever choose some of that again as the woman that I am today. But I don't regret it because it made me who I am today. And it made me like kind of get to that place where I'm like, I don't ever want to be her again. And I had to draw a line in the sand and go up level. And without that stuff, I would have never, ever, ever become the version of myself that I became today, right? One of my other favorite quotes is that the height of our light comes from the depths of our darkness. And I really think about shame when I hear that. In fact, like that's really what stressless eating and this podcast is. Like food used to be such a source of shame for me. Like my body was too, my entire being actually was shame. And that's really, again, this podcast wouldn't be there if I hadn't reconciled that shame, right? And shame, it's a silent killer. And to be honest, it's one of the main things that we heal in the stressless eating program because again, like you can fake it till you make it or positive think your way through life till you're blue in the face. But if shame is your emotional home, like if you're ashamed of who you are or where you are or like what you have or haven't done or your body or your relationship with food or any kind of shame, and then of course, there's the very common like shame about your shame. Like there's so many women that have shame because they know they're living in shame. But anyways, it's got to be addressed. Like it's the kind of thing that doesn't go away on its own and it doesn't fix itself. And so again, this is a much bigger conversation than the scope of just this episode. But again, the first step is awareness, like noticing what shame is driving the show or noticing where shame is driving the show and running your life. And just like the weight of the weight, it doesn't have to be there. Because yeah, guilt and shame can indeed be like these really powerful tools to make sure that you never stray too far from your own moral inner compass or your own values. But if you don't own them, like shame and guilt, and you don't become aware of when they show up, they can easily become a weapon of judgment, rejection, and just straight up disconnection from yourself. And so The trick is to notice when guilt and shame show up and see them for what they really are. Like, see them for what they're really trying to tell you. And the good news is I find with every woman I work with that guilt and shame, they follow patterns. And if you know the patterns to look for, you can address guilt and shame fairly quickly and fairly easily. Like, you don't have to go down that deep, dark rabbit hole or open an emotional can of worms or spend years in therapy to address it, right? But bottom line, you do have to own the shame and the guilt, or they will most certainly own you. All right, so step number 3 is to ditch the blame. So blame can show up in a number of ways. So whether it's pinning faults on yourself, on somebody else, or something else, it doesn't actually change or solve anything. And it essentially gives up ownership of your life. It also really just keeps you focusing on the past or focusing on the problem itself. And as you know, we've talked about this before, we create more of what we focus on. So let's go back to that cookie, for example, because of course I just find any reason to talk about warm chocolate chip cookies. So let's say I ate that cookie and guilt or shame creeps in. And so maybe my self-talk goes like, damn it, Leanne, it's all your fault. You know you're not supposed to be eating that. And so in turn, I blame myself, right? Or I might blame something else, like the cookie. Like, damn it, cookie, why are you there? Why are you even in my house, you irresistible, soft, chewy thing, right? And again, the drama in our self-talk is not always logical. In fact, it's usually not logical, right? Or perhaps I might blame somebody else, like my neighbor, for baking them for me in the first place. Like, doesn't she know doesn't she know I'm not eating cookies? Or why would she bake me those cookies? And again, this is not logical, and sometimes it's not usually very nice. Either way, not only does blame not solve anything, but it also keeps you focusing on the problem and not a solution. And again, just like all of the weight, it's not necessary. And so the only way to truly own your life is to take radical ownership and responsibility for it. But notice I didn't say blame for it, because sometimes things happen and there's no logical explanation. And again, you don't have to always like it, but it doesn't need to be anyone's fault per se. It could just be something that happened, even if you don't like it. But finger pointing and blaming, it doesn't take away or undo what happened or change the facts. In fact, it keeps you living in the past by dwelling on it. And most often, especially if you have your inner bitch on your shoulder, the finger usually gets pointed right back at yourself. That's what I find with most women. A lot of the blame goes towards themselves. So next time you're looking to assign blame to someone or something, just ask yourself, will this really change anything? And then focus on what you can influence and what you can do about the situation and how you do want to feel. And if you really want to become responsible and take full ownership of your life, just look at the situation objectively, without blame, from a cause and effect perspective, and just see what really happened, but without making it so personal. Because from there, you can actually get the information that you need to create a solution for the next time this comes up. And trust me, this or something like it will come up again if you don't address it. So bottom line, blame is a losing game. You have to own it, or it will definitely own you. Okay, cool. So step number 4, ditch the comparison. So the word nerd in me wants you to know that the word compare, it literally means to liken or rival. So let's nip this one in the butt, shall we? So there is no one like you. There never has been, there never will be. And there is no competition or fight or rivalry. And if there was one, it's not real. At least it doesn't have to be. It's in your head, and most likely it's not serving you. And so they say that comparison is the thief of joy. And I believe this could not be more true. Like, again, comparison can be a valuable tool, and, it can help us create distinctions in our mind. Like, figure out our own preference. Like comparing, like, I like the color blue more than I like the color orange. And it generally helps us detect apples from oranges. Like, that's what comparison in the brain does. But comparison can also be used as a weapon to judge and shame and critique ourselves and others, by the way. And so, comparison to what you shoulda, woulda, or coulda done, or where you should be, would be, or could be, it can easily turn someone, something, or some experience into a negative or harmful encounter, again, if you're not aware. So, for example, let's say I'm scrolling through my newsfeed on Facebook and like, oh, look, there's a picture of my family and friends and they're having fun and all these good feelings come through because I'm seeing this connection. Like, bam. Facebook is a tool of connection and companionship, or just like staying up to date on the lives of the people that I care about. But if I'm struggling with a case of comparisonitis, or like I'm in this energy of like lack or shame or feeling like crap about myself, bam, that same post on Facebook has now become a weapon of comparison, like judgment, self-deprecation, loneliness, isolation, and perhaps feeling like I lack in some way, or like I'm not good enough, or I'm left out, or whatever it is in that moment, right? And so here's the truth, like you're never gonna be just like anyone else. Like you're a snowflake, as cheesy as it may sound, and that will never change. But if you continue to liken and compare yourself to others, or make yourself wrong compared to others, and it's not serving you, which I guarantee you it's not, that's a mindset shift that you have the ability to make and shift right away. Because, the human brain, it's designed to spot patterns and create associations and make comparisons. But if those associations are making you feel less than, that's on you, and you don't have to keep doing it. And so what if you just started owning the fact that you are uniquely you, and you're not meant to be a carbon copy of someone else? And like we talked about last week, you like address those 5 ingredients so that you're no longer comparing it to anybody else. Like you're in your own category, right? Like what if you were able to notice the differences between like you and somebody else, but you didn't use it as a weapon to judge yourself or critique yourself or shame yourself? Like what if you started with self-acceptance first and comparison second? Like it's a totally different game when you're coming from a place of acceptance. Comparison doesn't have that power over you, right? And so again, remember, we're wired to make comparisons, judgments, and associations. Like our brain will never not do that. And so saying not to do it isn't realistic, because there's a lot of self-help stuff out there that's like, just stop comparing and stop judging and all that. And it's like, no, that's not actually possible. But when you know who, what, and why, and how you're comparing, and if it's not serving you in your happiness, you can totally own it. And if not, again, like if you don't own it, it will own you. All right. So let's go into our 5th and final step, which is ditch the perfectionism. All right. So call it what you want. Perfectionism, control, micromanaging yourself and everything you do or say. And if it serves you, that's great. The truth is, I've yet to meet a woman that doesn't drive herself crazy over perfectionism, and she doesn't even know it. And I refer to perfectionism as a losing game because it's this unattainable thing, and it's really just an attempt at control. And so most women think it's like the highest standard, that like perfectionism, I can say the word, is the highest standard. But my mentor pointed out to me one time, like she said, it's actually the lowest standard because it's so attainable. And so again, this comes back to our beliefs about perfectionism. And so it's perfectly natural to desire that things happen in a certain way. But when we create requirements that everything happens according to plan, or like requirements to be happy, to feel successful, to feel good about ourselves, like that's when it backfires. And it's only because we will never truly be able to control everything and everyone in our lives or in ourselves. Like it's an impossibility. But we do have the power to influence ourselves and our lives to our greatest abilities, like influence what we can and release what we cannot control. But there's this other side of perfectionism and being a perfectionist that doesn't really get talked about very often. Like nobody explained it to me and I had to realize it, or I didn't realize it until I realized it. And what I found is that perfectionists, they often wear perfectionism like it's a badge of honor. Like, and hey, I did this for most of my life, so this is no judgment for me, but it's like this badge of honor, like, oh yeah, I'm such a perfectionist and all that. But perfectionism is a weapon in disguise. Like, don't let it fool you. So back to some word nerdery. The word perfect, it literally means to bring to full development. So can we just all agree that you are never doing anything at your absolute full potential? Like, there's always going to be a better, faster, easier, more perfect way to do something or version of you, right? But you know what I learned from attempting, I should say, to be overly perfectionistic? It kept me from living my life, ladies. It kept me from getting off the sidelines, like getting in the game and trying stuff out. In turn, I created a habit of waiting, like getting ready to get ready, like planning and preparing and outlining and plotting, but like not doing, like a lot of saying and not as much doing, and a lot of wishing, but also a lot of waiting, because I was afraid that like if I wasn't going to be perfect at it, I couldn't do it at all. Actually, side note, confession, this podcast is an example of that. Like, I had a podcast in me for so many years, and my inner perfectionist like really didn't let me bring it to life. And finally I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna, it's like, what's that quote? Get it going rather than get it perfect, right? So anyways, back to this idea of perfectionism. Like, what if we agreed on a new definition of perfect, or like the real definition, like that you'll never be at your full development, like really until the day you die. Like, so how about in the meantime, you just do your best, like strive for excellent, like keep focusing on developing yourself into the perfect person that would do it even more perfect-er, which is a real word that I just made up, do it more perfect-er the next time you do it. And because I know lifelong perfectionists, like you don't just suddenly go change overnight, let me give you some helpful insight that might be helpful for you. So what if you just started being okay with perfect-ish? And like what I really mean is, what if you just were particular about what really matters to you? Like, get clear on what you really want, like what you prefer and the things that you do want to spend more focused attention on. And by all means, like spend a lot of time and attention and energy on those things. Like, go do your best, like healthfully obsess over stuff, right? But get off the sidelines. Like, stop waiting for things to be perfect. Go get out there, fall down, get a bit messy, take some wrong turns, fall down again, take the lessons, and try again if it's something that you really want. But please, I'm inviting you to drop the I'm a perfectionist label as a badge of honor, because it's keeping you from living your life, and it's not a label that I believe is serving you. And so from one recovering perfectionist to another, what if you just started being okay with perfect-ish? All right, so bottom line, breaking up with your inner bitch, it really just starts with awareness. And that was the purpose of this episode. So if you can identify where you're talking to yourself about yourself through the eyes of guilt, shame, blame, comparisonitis, or perfectionism, and really just start talking to yourself with acceptance and compassion and understanding, which again, I know is so much easier said than done, and it goes beyond the scope of this episode, but I just had to share it. Your life is going to completely change. Like, if that's all you did, your life would totally shift. And I know it's simple, not easy. And I'll be the first to admit that this isn't the thing that changes overnight without serious commitment and a proven strategy and plan and help. But I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't at least help you see what the real problem is. Because your inner self-talk determines what you say, what you do, and how you feel every single day. And influencing it is one of the most powerful things you can do to influence your entire life. But again, it all starts with awareness. So if you're currently talking to yourself in a certain way, like regarding yourself a certain way, looking at yourself a certain way, and generally treating yourself like crap, it's time for something better. Like, it's time for a new way of seeing things and a new way of doing things. And that's because, I don't believe that you or any woman has, a confidence problem or a willpower problem or even a weight problem. And I don't think that you lack motivation or willpower or purposely self-sabotage your journey. all of those things are just symptoms that you've been practicing a relationship with yourself that doesn't serve you, and it's keeping you from being truly happy and from being truly fulfilled. And again, it's a very heavy and weighted relationship, and it is all dead weight. Like, it does not have to be there, and you don't have to keep practicing it. You don't have to have this relationship with yourself any longer. Like, you know you want more, and I'm here to tell you, you deserve more. So if you feel like you are in a relationship with your own inner, biggest bitch, rather than being your own BFF, like, it's time for you to ditch her. And so it's time to break up with your old self, like your old way of thinking, your old way of treating yourself, and go meet yourself again. Like, go create yourself again. That is the power that you have. You have the power to change your thoughts, and it's a power that any woman can cultivate starting right away. Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard and you're interested in breaking out of your own food, body, and diet prison, here's what I want you to do next. Head on over to stresslesseating.com. That's stresslesseating.com, and sign up to watch the Stressless Eating webinar, where I'll walk you through the exact 5-step game plan my female clients use to conquer emotional eating, self-sabotage, and finally heal themselves from the restrictive all-or-nothing diet mentality for good, but without obsessing or spending years in therapy to address it. I've laid it all out for you there in 5 easy steps. Remember, healing your relationship with food and your body does not happen by itself. You need expert guidance to make it happen, and we've helped clients all over the world take back their power from the food and find true and lasting freedom, while enjoying life and warm chocolate chip cookies along the way. To see if we can help you do the same, head on over to stresslesseating.com. I'm Leanne Ellington, and I'll see you next time.